You're listening to the 2020 Nelson Arts Festival Pukapuka Talks. This session, Wild at Heart, features Miriam Lancewood in conversation with Kerry Sunderland. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to the Nelson Arts Festival's Pukapuka Talks. My name is Kerry Sunderland, and I'm the coordinator of the program, and it's also my great pleasure to be here this morning to have a chat with Miriam Lancewood about her new book, Wild at Heart. So just a few housekeeping things first. If you could make sure your phones are on silent or switched off, that would be great. And it's okay if you want to take a photo, as long as you don't use a flash, which you probably won't need with these house lights anyway. And Miriam says you're welcome to share it on social media and tell people all about her book, which is fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to do a brief introduction for Miriam, but it's very brief, and then we're going to launch right into talking about Wild at Heart. Yeah, sound good? Yeah. So Miriam was born in the Netherlands in 1983, and she trained as a PE teacher, and then she set off on her travelling adventures in her early 20s, and it was where she met Peter in India when she was 22 years old, and that's almost 15 years ago now, yeah? Yeah, that's right. So, and then of course, I'm sure many of you in the audience would know that Miriam and Peter spent, was it 6 years or 7 years living in the wilderness of New Zealand? 7 years living in the bush. And in 2017, Miriam's book, Woman in the Wilderness, was published, and it became an international bestseller and has been translated into, do you know how many different languages it's been translated into?
4, and the fifth one is on the way.
And we'll talk a little bit about that a little later. So Women in the Wilderness was a really big hit, and now we have Wild at Heart, which you can see in front of me, which is a sequel, which was just launched about 3 weeks ago, was it? Yeah, great. Cool. Okay, so I understand that it was your videos, or some videos that were made about you and Peter living in the New Zealand wilderness that led to Ellen and Unwin contacting you with a book deal. Is that correct?
More or less. But you talk about the first book, right?
Yeah, the first book, yeah.
I actually wrote a little article for Mindfood. A friend asked me to write down just one day of our life, and I did this, and I sent it to this magazine called Mindfood, and I took it, and then luckily Jenny Helen from Ellen and Unwin read this article, and she asked me to write a book.
How lucky is that? So for people like me who've slaved away trying to submit books out, or like manuscripts all over the time. No. But I remember last year when we had a conversation at Pukapuka Talks last year about the first book. I think you said at one point that you didn't really think of yourself as a writer. But now you've written 2 books, so I think you should definitely call yourself a writer. Do you think of yourself as a writer now?
When I meet, I've been to quite a few writers' festivals now, and then I listen to other people with the struggle of writing, and then I sort of recognize that.
Yeah.
And I think, wow, yeah.
Yeah, maybe you are a writer.
Well, when I'm writing, I'm a writer, but no, I don't feel like that.
So I want to ask you, I mean, obviously there was something that led to that first Mindfood article, and whether or not you call yourself a writer, what is it that drives you to write? Is it a desire for self-expression, or what is it that, why do you use the written word to tell your story?
For Wild at Heart, and now we're jumping forward in the story, Peter was sick, and we lived in Marahau at the time, and we were in a house, and we had actually not much to do. And Peter said, since you got nothing to do, why don't you start writing?
Okay.
The story done. Yeah. So I made good use of the time there, and the electricity, and the laptop.
Yeah. Yeah, okay.
So not so much of the expression of our of creativity. I think that the creativity can be expressed in many different ways. My favorite one is to think creatively what to do in life, and what other adventures are coming.
Yeah. Cool. We'll talk about that too. So, Women in the Wilderness recounts your time in the wilderness. while Wild at Heart is much more of a story about your experiences moving through quite a different landscape, and that's in Europe. And there's very little, compared to New Zealand, there's where you were travelling, there's a lot less wilderness than there is here. Would you say so? And so, but you still attempted to set off on a road less travelled when you were moving around Europe.
Europe, yeah. We thought, so we walked Te Araroa Trail from Cape Reinga to Bluff. It's 3,000 kilometers. Then we thought, oh, this is great. This is a great way of living, actually. Let's do the same in Europe. And we looked on the internet for different walkways, and we found the E4 walkway. And then it was quite hard to find maps. And then we thought, oh, it doesn't matter, actually. We just asked the other people on the trail where to go. And then we discovered there was no one on the trail. Yeah, it was not at all. Not many people walk through Europe. They do, of course, walk the Compostela road, those more famous ones, but not the E4.
Yeah. So is that how you define wilderness? Is it the absence of other people? How do you define wilderness?
I would say wilderness is no sign of humans at all.
Okay.
Yeah. So I would say there's not much wilderness in Europe, at least not what we've seen.
Yeah.
I would call that nature, which is also very beautiful. And we walk through endless forests, especially in Western Europe and then again in Bulgaria, because a lot of people have moved to the cities, and all these fields have become regenerating forest. And so it was amazing how much forest we walked through. Couldn't believe it.
Yeah. I know you don't have Netflix when you're living in the bush, but have you seen David Attenborough's new documentary? What's the title of it? A Life on Earth. It's his witness statement about what's happened in he's 93 now, and what's happened over his lifetime. And in that time, I think there was about 66% wilderness left on the planet when he was a boy, about 10, and today, sadly, there's only about 35% left. So
of true wilderness, but I would say maybe the forest has actually increased.
Okay.
So what does he mean with wilderness? Because what we've seen is actually very positive, and it has changed our view about the earth. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, interesting. I think part of the definition of wilderness for him is also about the biodiversity and the number of different animals and creatures living in the bush. Yeah. So I'd actually like to ask you to do a bit of a reading about that moment when you found some real genuine wilderness in Germany.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, there were some really wild parts, especially in Germany, in the Emmergau Alps.
Yeah, so it's page 68 from, hopefully the page numbers. I've got a reading copy, so we'll see if they're exactly the same. Yep, from that section, yes.
Further up the valley, it was surprisingly quiet. None of the tourists ventured past this bridge. We looked for somewhere to camp, but we were surrounded by vertical rock faces. Forced to climb up and up and up, we left the last traces of civilization behind and arrived at a pass in twilight. From the tops, the sky was wide and far, giving an enormous sense of space. Orange and red clouds were smoothed by the wind and streamed in one direction. We could see many peaks of the Emmergauer Alps. We found a flat spot and pitched the tent. Although it had been a long day, we felt energized. It was as if we were back in a real wilderness. I felt I could run forever, living off fresh air and drinking clean water seeping from the rocks. The rawness, the altitude, the untamed powers created a different kind of energy. There was a joyous fire inside of me that made me feel very vulnerable, yet courageous at the same time. Next morning, we hiked towards a higher pass. We were surrounded by gravel and rocks, and the last bit we had to climb with hands and feet. We rested on top, looking out over the eastern ranges, stretching far into Austria. After some food, we walked and slid down the mountain. The terrain was steep, with some parts angling down a rock face. It was hot. We had sweated a lot coming up. We still had a way to descend, and were completely out of water. Then we saw a distant cliff glistening in the sun. While Peter rested, I took the bottles and climbed towards the waterfall. It was much further than I thought, and on the way I spotted a large group of mountain chamois. These brilliant creatures, related to the antelope, are not much bigger than a goat and have brown fur and small white faces with a stripe of brown running from the nose to the ears. They have pretty spiky horns that curl backwards at the tips. We had seen them occasionally in New Zealand, where they had been introduced from Europe. They are now classified as a pest, and the New Zealand government spends a lot of effort keeping the numbers down. To see them in a natural habitat was wonderful. They were grazing so quietly. They saw me, but they were not afraid. Some of the leading animals seemed to look up at the sky, and the flock was slowly moving down the valley. Clouds were building up in the distance, and the wind seemed to increase. "I think there's a storm coming," I said to Peter when I got back. "We better find shelter in the trees for tonight." I didn't want to go too far down the valley. I wanted to stay as long as possible in the wildest places. I wanted to feel the full force and immensity of the storm in the mountains, to strengthen my heart. So we made a camp at the first bit of forest we saw. The big, old, gnarly trees were at the bottom of an ancient rock slide. They were bent down and shaped by wind and lightning, storms, floods, and stone avalanches. They had been here a long time, and we felt protected. While a strange glow of purple and green inhabited the sky, we lit a fire to cook our meal. When the shadow overtook the valley, the temperature plummeted. Wearing all our clothes, we sat on a rock to watch the immense dark clouds slowly floating towards us. The open tops of the rocky peaks were waiting for the fury. It was eerily silent, with not a sound of even a bird. I felt tension building up, and I had to resist an urge to hide in a tent. It began with a distant rumble and flashes on the horizon. When it moved towards us, we saw huge, jagged lightning strikes. They filled the sky and created a strange yellow light. Some were directed to Earth, but some jumped from cloud to cloud. It was frightening, yet exhilarating. As the storm came closer, the thunder and echo became continuous. The lightning flashes were so constant, they had a stroboscopic effect. My head felt strange, as though I was lifted towards the sky by invisible hands. My body and mind were completely part of the lightning storm. My sense of self ceased to exist for a moment, and I received a huge charge of energy.
Wow, thank you very much. A couple of lines really struck me in that piece, which is why I asked you to read it. And one of them was, "I wanted to feel the full force and immensity of the storm in the mountains to strengthen my heart." Can you tell us a little bit more about that strengthening of the heart? What do you mean?
Yeah, some people maybe have you ever jumped in a cold sea in the winter? Or sat underneath a waterfall or something like that? Or indeed see the thunderstorm? You sort of receive, if you do this willingly, you receive the energy of the storm, of the water, of the waterfall. And if you do this willingly, that power becomes part of you.
So it's really about a connection with the natural world that sort of makes you feel part of something.
Yeah. Also surrender to the power of it.
Yeah, beautiful. So in many ways, from the first book to the second book, it's a shift from, obviously with the exception of your story of walking the Te Araroa at the end of Woman in the Wilderness. Because when you're in the wilderness, you didn't have an itinerary or an agenda. You weren't moving from A to B, but on the trail, and then, of course, walking across Europe, you were sort of more nomadic. So how is it different being nomadic to being just living in the wilderness, sort of knowing that you're going to move in a certain direction?
Walking from A to B is very different from staying in one place, indeed. Because if you walk from A to B, like we did on the Te Araroa in our long walk, you have a goal in mind. And then you're automatically in time. So you are thinking of how many weeks it will be until the end, right? Which is very different from living in one place, because then the sense of time seems to completely disappear. And the Greek have a word for this, the chronos, living in time, and identifying with time. So we identify, in the city, everything is on in the planning. You know exactly what day of the week it is, you know what time it is. You know what the past is, you identify with the past and project in the future. So that's chronos, right, let's say. And kairos is a wholly different sense of time. And that's what we find living in one place in the wilderness, when the time seems to disappear. And one day feels like a week. It's absolutely amazing. And at the same time, there doesn't seem to be a past And this is when we first left for the wilderness. We said goodbye to family and friends. We had no planning. And suddenly we found ourselves like in the void. It was a really strange experience. I recommend it. Just do it.
But didn't you admit that you were a little bit bored before you slipped into that different sense of time?
Yes, indeed. It takes about 2 weeks for the mind to slow down and meet with the rhythm of nature. And in those 2 weeks, you will be bored to death. It is really quite agonizing because all my life I've been avoiding boredom. No, everyone would, right? And so to go through boredom, what Nietzsche calls deep boredom, you come to a different state of mind. But you have to go through that. And not many people have 2 weeks time to...
So do you get to that stage when you're being nomadic as much as you are when you're staying put, or is it not quite possible when you're moving through the landscape?
Quite different when you are doing long walking. You have to be quite focused in order to do it. So it's a very different state of mind.
Yeah. So you're more in Kronos when you're nomadic.
More. Yeah, more in Kronos. You're right. Yeah, more in
Yeah.
Kronos when you're nomadic.
Cool. So I think it was actually Peter who said that giving up comfort and security gives you the chance to live life more intensely.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah. So we believe, this might just be a belief, we believe that we are quite free. And of course we have to then give up security. And planning the future and having a safety net of a group of family and friends. I don't see my family very often. No regular income. And no security of what's going to... We have no idea what's going to happen next year, where we will be next year.
So there's always a risk that you might fall off the edge.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, and Peter points that out in the beginning of the book.
Yeah, and you met Amy fairly early in your travels, I think, who said, I was really struck by her saying that if you live in a conversation with you, that if you live too long in one place, the world becomes smaller and smaller in a terrifying way. Do you remember? Yeah, that bit. So yeah, that kind of really...
Yeah, we met this woman who lives in 3 continents in all over the world. And when we first met her, we thought, wow, that's a good idea. And so we meet people and then get new ideas on what to do. So that's when we start to think, and she suggested it too, that, hey, on our walks in Europe, we might actually come across a really cheap little house. Because there's a lot in Europe, you can find really cheap houses in the countryside because people go to the cities. And this is what happened.
Yeah, so we'll come back to that, buying the house bit in a minute. But have you been in touch with Amy? I mean, she can't travel between 3 continents at the moment. No, because of COVID.
Yeah, I never thought of that.
She might be being quite terrified at the moment.
Yeah, she must be staying put right now. Yeah.
So in your travels, I mean, it's a real, I know from my own experience, it's such a wonderful opportunity to look at the world through a different lens and to explore different things that you don't normally think about. Well, not that you've done this for a long time, but that I don't normally think about when I'm in my routine, in my average routine. And so I loved the conversations that you and Peter have throughout this book, where you just ask the most extraordinary questions, I think. So I'm just flicking to find this extraordinary question. Oh, this is the one where you say to him, imagine if you were living in this village and so you're in France and, you know, sort of going back and really tuning in with what it must have been like at the end of the war or during the war. And and you believe the Marquis will save France in the long run. Then the Nazis come and give you a choice. Either you die or you tell them where the partisans are. What would you do? So you have conversations like this, I think, quite regularly as you're travelling around.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. Well, what would you do?
Yeah.
You know, if in a war situation. Yeah. And Peter and I like to think, you know, after 7 years in the wilderness, we are having enough skills to survive out there in case of a pandemic and war situation and all those sort of things. And we actually found out how difficult it is. It is really very, very difficult, and we tested it. Yes, and so in a war situation, the first thing I would get is a gun and lots of ammunition. Rule number 1. Yeah, so I would be focused on that. I would never have said this, you know, growing up in Holland. I thought guns was a symbol of evil. Other kids were playing in the village with guns and all that. I never did. Evil. So, I find it quite funny for me to
When you say you
focus on
tested
this.
it, whether it was easy to do, was it easier to do in New Zealand than it was to do in Europe? Or
Living off the land?
yeah. I mean, obviously, yeah, you couldn't walk around with a rifle when you were wandering through
So when we
countries.
went to Europe, I did not bring my rifle. I did not hunt in Europe because it's very difficult to get your firearms overseas, and you can't get a hunting license there so easily. There are many more people in Europe, of course, but there's so many fruit trees and berries and nuts. I don't know what would be easier to survive. Where it would be easier? No. Maybe
As
quite
long as you
equal.
had ammunition, maybe you could still hunt in this.
Yeah,
New
and I can
Zealand.
only get ammunition here in New Zealand. Yeah.
You touched on it a little earlier, but I want to ask you again, what does freedom mean to you and to Peter? Like, do you have different definitions, or do you agree on what freedom means?
Yeah, quite. Well, it's such a big concept, isn't it?
Mm.
I think if you put the question the other way around, I think it's also freedom of time. So the moment everything is too much planned, I feel I've lost my freedom. Like if I have, if I have a job for a starter, say if I'm back in teaching, then I know exactly what I'm going to do in the next year. That feels for me unfree. That's just personal, of course. And I also discovered on this journey that we believe that the less we own, the more free we are. And that's what we have in common, I think. And so that's why we have less possessions, and we don't have to worry about those possessions. First of all, we don't have to buy them, and then we don't have to look after them, and we don't have to worry about them getting stolen and all. So that gives us a sense of freedom.
And we were chatting backstage, and you talked about that idea of when you were working and you were looking forward to the weekend. Do you want to?
Yes, indeed. When I was working in Blenheim, I was a teacher, and I noticed that I was always looking forward to the weekend because we went tramping every weekend. And then I thought, hang on a minute, if I'm looking forward to Saturday, but it's only Tuesday. So I'm wishing away Wednesday, Thursday and Friday. Do this long enough and you wish half your life away, which is like a crime against your life in a way. And I thought, I don't want to live like that.
No, neither do I.
It would be a pity.
Watch this space. Your keen powers of observation and being present with the world around you are, in Woman in the Wilderness, are very much about the natural world. But I found that you did the same thing in Wild at Heart by observing the human world around you, because you were interacting with a lot more people, and you were walking through towns and villages and all that sort of thing. So you had an ability to examine social structures with an acuity I find very admirable. Bit envious of. I'd like to develop it too. So I want to, and I really particularly enjoyed your time, your interactions, and your observations. Your slow realization that the person you went to visit in Austria was perhaps a cult leader. Can you tell us a little bit about that story?
Well, we walked 1,000 kilometers through West Europe, right? And in the end, we were both very tired. We needed a place to rest. Unlike New Zealand, where we would just camp for a week after I shot a goat and eat it and camp and rest, we could not really rest very much in Germany. So then Peter said, I remember I've got a friend around here. His name is Simon. I know him from India. And so went to an internet cafe, contacted him, and indeed he said, fantastic, Peter. He didn't know me, of course. Peter, to see you, and you're welcome at any time. And so we rang the bell, and he was there. And he said, why don't you stay in one of my ashrams? An ashram? And he said, I've got 5 ashrams. And I sort of said, so what's going on? He turns out to be a guru. And he had 5 girlfriends. And they're all young, blonde-looking German girls. And so we thought, okay, we stay in the ashram. We contributed some money to it, and we could stay there for as long as we wanted. And then he said, would you like to become part of this ashram? And I thought, if I now say no, then it shows that we actually never believed him to be a guru in the first place. So I said, oh yeah, sure. I mean, what does it matter? And so I received a real name. So this was his whole. So he was a satsang teacher. I don't know who is familiar with this, but sort of a meeting chat, a bit like this actually. And so he invited me to sit down, and then I received a name. He made up the name of Diana, born error. And in this story, it's much longer than it is. But so we had to play the whole game in order to stay there a little bit longer. And in the same session as my name ceremony, he also started fighting with one of his 5 girlfriends right on the stage. It sounded like a domestic fight. And we thought, well, this is not on. What should we do? Walk out, or support her or support him, or what do you do? And then we thought, well, she's an adult. But it was really nasty. And so his true colors came out there. And so, I described it all. And it's really tricky because he sounds quite plausible. And he obviously read a lot about the topic. He's very clever. And he sort of deceived those girls. And then one time, I found one of these girlfriends in the kitchen. She was crying. And then I said, oh, what's the matter? And she says, oh, maybe I just want a boyfriend for myself. I said, why? You can't just go home and go back to your family. And she says, no, it's all the ego that is making mayhem, there's creating chaos. I have to get over my ego and to dissolve the self in order to get to nirvana. And I said, well, how can you make any choice of any kind if you cannot trust your own thought? And she says, no, I can't, but I can trust Simon. And then I realized he had made this labyrinth, and people can get in, but they can never quite get to the center of it, which is nirvana, and they also can never get out. And so we started to see the whole structure of this cult, this ashram.
Yeah, I love the line you say, once you were in his maze, he had very cleverly erased the exit. Yeah. But you did manage to exit.
Yeah, we escaped.
Yeah. So did you have to escape, or did you just say, we're going, and walk away? Yeah. Wasn't in the middle of the night, okay. But another interesting thing that you write about in that time was that your physical health deteriorated while you were in the ashram.
Because he had this habit of going to sleep at 3 o'clock at night and then sleep till 2 o'clock the next afternoon. And so he would come to the ashram and keep everyone awake. And some of his girlfriends had small babies in it. So the small children wake up at 7 o'clock, like me. And so we all slept like 3 or 4 hours every night, and I got more and more and more tired. Not a good rest place at all. And then we started to drink a lot of coffee to sort of keep up. And I saw myself just deteriorating. Yeah, so we were there 3 weeks in total, I think.
Yeah, you had overdosed of coffee to get through the day and felt unbalanced in every sense of the word. Yeah. So the other thing, so that's sort of very practical, but an interesting conceptual thing that I believe you discovered in that time with him was the difference between, well, you write about it anyway, the difference between belief and knowing. Can you talk, do you remember that? There was some comments you made around.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So, it's a joke about Bobby, which we make often. But so what do we believe what we are? So it was about Simon. Is he really enlightened, or does he believe he's enlightened and knows he's not? And of course, that's the story of mankind. Do we believe we have a free life and know we are not? Or are we really having a free life, or a happy life? What is happiness? Yeah, so it's two different things. And especially I talk about in the book about relationship, because some people fight every day in their marriage, and they still believe they love each other. And surely they know they're not. Yeah, so it is actually happening quite often.
Yeah, it's a great thing to ask ourselves, I think, all the time. Mm. So then you go, I think, to when you arrive in Bulgaria, you meet 5-year-old Radha. Tell us about Radha. Is that how you pronounce her name?
Yeah,
The
Radha.
little girl. Yeah.
Yeah, so we went from the guru to Bulgaria because there was a Dutch woman who read the book, and she said, if you're ever in Bulgaria, please come and see us. I said, oh yeah, where's Bulgaria? And Bulgaria is just north of Greece and west of Turkey. And so we took a bus and went to Bulgaria to meet this woman. And in the same village, they had sort of a village of, not a cult at all, they had a village with people who did not want to put their kids into school. And they just sort of did homeschooling, but actually just let them play. And I thought it was quite interesting. I want to see those kids. And it's amazing how many of them could speak fluently different languages. And one of them was Radha. And she was only 5-year-old. And the amazing thing was, we were camping there, and sometimes she would come and visit us. You know, she's this high. And then she would sit down on a stone. And the amazing thing was that she felt like an equal to us, and we talked to her like an equal. And then I thought, wow, it seems, especially just coming from the guru, that this little child was almost enlightened compared to the guru. And for example, she would walk just through the night up. It was quite a far little zigzag to our tent, and she would walk in the middle of the night and not at all be afraid, even though the day before Radha and I had seen a snake there. And she was not afraid, and she would just sit down. And I've written down that I made some notes when she was there, and amazing comments that she. And the expression was like a 16-year-old. It was really a remarkable meeting.
I want to ask you about that, writing notes as you were travelling. Did you, as you were travelling, and it was in 2018 that this journey happened, were you thinking, oh, this might be another book, or were you planning to write another book and you were keeping notes for it?
Yeah, it was a little bit in the back of my mind,
Yeah.
especially if amazing things happened. Then I quickly wrote them down. I had a tiny diary because we had to carry everything, so it had to be light.
Yeah,
And I wrote some dialogues on that down.
yeah, yeah. She was adorable. I loved her. And her English, she commented on how amazing she was with English at such a
She
young
was a
age.
Bulgarian girl. She had
Yeah.
fluent English.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
But also, you know, much older than her years. She had
Oh, yeah.
vocabulary of what an adult. And
Yeah, it was astonishing.
yeah, yeah. So, have you always paid attention to life, or was it your connection with the natural world that taught you that you're not the centre of the universe and to look out? That came from Paulo Coelho, actually. That was sort of a thing I was watching, because there's another question I have about a line from him later. But yeah, have you always been the sort of person that pays great attention to the world around you?
No, I think when I was in Holland and busy with school and I was doing athletics, pole vaulting, I was completely focused. I was occupied. I think the moment you have an occupation, you are focused. If you don't have an occupation, you have awareness and have actually time to look around. So I think it has to do with time.
Time, yeah, yeah. Ah, that precious commodity in many people's lives. I'm sure a lot of people here can relate to that. So I'm going to ask you about being bilingual now. So how many languages do you now speak?
Oh, really only Dutch and English.
Really? Okay, because you teach yourself Bulgarian when you're there. So tell us about that.
Yeah, also on the way in France and Germany, I tried to learn a few words. And so we're walking and then we're running out of food. So then I go into the village nearby and sometimes I have to hitchhike and then come back to Peter and we carry on walking. So when you hitchhike, you're always saying the same things. And so I learned how to say these, the standard things in French and German and that. And then in Bulgaria, they speak Bulgarian. It's a little bit close to Russian, and they've got a totally different script. So I never learned any of that. But we found a little place where we wanted to rest. And there was a village that had completely fallen down, and there's only one house standing, and in that one house was one old man with 2 goats, 5 sheep, and 3 dogs and 1 cat. His name is Zdravko. And Zdravko could not speak a word of English. And so I went to him every morning. I had coffee with him. And I could only say, what is this? And so he would say, massa. So I write that down phonetically. And then every time, I just pointed at everything, and the weather and everything. And that's how I learned words in Bulgarian. I can't say I made sentences out of it, but I just put the words together, and then Stravko could understand me. And then a little bit later, we found a little cottage. That was, took us a long time, but in the end we found the owner. And then we wanted to buy this cottage. It cost 4,000 New Zealand dollars. Can't go wrong there, I thought. And so it has no electricity. I got running water outside. It is away from the village. It's 1,200 meters up. You can see it in the book. It's a picture. We absolutely love it. We bought it, never been back, but it doesn't matter. It's like a holiday home. But I went to the International Asset Bank, and they could also not speak a word of English. And then I went to the notary, and she could not speak much English either. So I had to learn quite a bit of Bulgarian in order to buy the house.
That's a big incentive. You write, though, in the book about how when you decided you wanted to find somewhere to buy, because you looked for quite a little while to find this place that you bought, that something significant shifted in your perception of the world around you. Like once you decided you wanted to find somewhere to live.
Yeah, indeed. It's amazing to walk through and think, oh, yeah, nice. Like, oh, I might never come back here again. Or, like, hey, we might buy this place, and this place will now become part of us. And so, much more, I guess, you identify with the place. But it brings a whole new reality with it. Yeah, it was really interesting to walk through a place and think you might want to buy something, especially if it's so cheap.
It's kind of exciting, isn't it? And it's fun because you can start. But you said, that thing about not looking forward to the future, but thinking about buying a house kind of gives you, it helps you daydream a little bit of a future, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And we do this as our entertainment, but not sort of fixed plans. Yeah. I think that's the difference. Yeah.
And you just said, you haven't been back, and that's okay. But how does it make you feel that you can't go back at the moment?
With COVID?
Yeah.
Well, it's okay. New Zealand is a good place to be at the moment.
Yeah, yeah, true.
But I do hope the border will open again and we go back to Bulgaria.
Yeah. And a little later in the book, just sort of coming back to that idea of, and I'm going to ask you a few times about this because there's a few times it happens in the book, but that you were really sick with, I think you had a really bad flu or something at one point, but as you started to get well again, you noticed that your desire for a house only manifested when you were ill and disappeared when you were well.
Yeah, that's right. When I was sick, and that was in Turkey, I suddenly noticed that I would just love to have a bed with clean sheets, not this dirty sleeping bag, and maybe a pillow, and just a little bit more comfort. And then I thought, yeah, actually, civilization is great when you're sick. But it would be a pity, really, to live in all that comfort when you don't need it yet. But it has its function.
Yeah, I think we can all relate to that too. Okay, so you have lots of adventures, and there's lots of you see the road less travelled in Europe, and you write about the road less travelled, and so it's in some ways, Wild at Heart I highly recommend it as a way of cathartic travelling at the moment. While we can't travel overseas, it's a great book to read. It certainly reminded me of my time travelling through Europe. So that was fantastic. But then you you had a commitment in Australia at the Byron Bay Writers Festival.
Yeah, so we like to go through open doors. So this Dutch woman in Bulgaria said, well, if you're in Bulgaria, come around. And then I received an email from the Byron Bay Writers Festival in Australia. And they said, we'd like you to come and speak for the festival, and we buy you both a ticket. I thought, well, that's great. Off we go. So we flew to Australia. And we didn't know what we're going to do after, but we thought surely something come up. And indeed, we received an email from a woman who had read the book, a Dutch woman, and she said, it's amazing, we are exactly like you. We also live in a tent. I am Dutch, my partner, who's Australian, also 20 years older, and to have you around our campfire would be a dream. And they had horses. So I thought, this is great. So after the festival, we flew 7 hours, this is quite a long way, from Byron Bay to Perth, where they lived. And that's where things went completely wrong.
Do tell, Miriam.
Well, in the book, it's sort of, the build-up of the tension. But it went completely wrong. I guess they had different expectations. They thought we were exactly the same. I think he's mad. I think he's completely mad. Because after only 4 days, he got so angry, and also enormous power, actually. The guy's really strong. And he started shouting, and, well, this is a long story, but in the end, he said, "You're completely evil. Oh, I'm going to chop your head off and going to throw you in the swamp, and no one would ever know it." And we were like, we had no idea where we were. We had too much luggage to sort of run off. We had to get out and just walk out. We were in the middle of the wheat belt near Perth. It was an absolute nightmare. Never been this afraid in my life. Yeah, it reminded me of Wolf Creek.
Yeah, there's some. I'm Australian. There's some crazy Australians. Yeah, I think actually you mentioned fear. I'm going to ask you about fear again in a minute, but you noticed that in Europe you were afraid of bears when you were in Europe, weren't you?
Yeah, so in New Zealand we have no dangerous animals, obviously. And this is very different in Europe, where there is bears and wolves. And we heard the story of a bear attack, that the bear had just ripped open a tent and attacked the man and the woman in there. And after hearing this story, I got really afraid every night. Yeah, very unpleasant.
And then sometimes you came across some characters that were a little bit iffy, that made you a bit nervous too, from time to time as you were travelling. Yeah.
Hitchhiking.
Yeah. So, okay, so life changed course when Peter got sick in the Australian desert, and but he'd already reached the conclusion that his days of long walking were probably over. And you'd also figured out when you very first met, back when you were 22, that if you chose to go to spend your life with him, that it might be inevitable because of the age difference, that he would die one day.
Yeah, I had this voice. So I met Peter in India almost 15 years ago, and he was living in a little hut on an island in the state of Karnataka. And I walked into his hut and I heard in the back of my head a voice saying, "If you go with this man, you will see him die." And I thought, I should consider this. And I thought, yeah, okay, I'll still go with him. At the time, I thought he would fall off the mountain in the Himalayas, because that's what we're going to do. We already had sort of thought of this in the first night. And we walked the Himalayas. He did not fall off. He survives. Then we went to Papua New Guinea, and he got malaria. And 2 strains of malaria, very dangerous, but he survived. And then he got sick in Australia. And then for the 3rd time, I thought, no, he will die, like prediction, but he did not. Yeah, so it has always been in the back of my head that because of the age difference, that I might see him die. But this also means that we don't take each other for granted. That I think he might die at any time. So we may as well enjoy the day. And he thinks that I finally realized that 30 years is a big age gap, and then I'll go off with someone younger. So we don't take each other for granted. And I think this is really good.
It's essential for a happy relationship, absolutely. But this time, compared to, the malaria might have been the same case, but when his kidneys failed and he was hospitalised, it was much more likely that you had the doctors saying that there was a very good chance.
The doctor was saying that chance on total organ failure. Well, that sounds very bad. Yeah, so he got a stomach bug, then dehydrated, and so badly that he was fainting all the time. So luckily we were close to the hospital, and I brought him into the hospital, and straight away he was put on a drip. And a few days later, his kidney started to fail. And so then the doctors were talking about total organ failure. It's amazing that you can almost die of dehydration without ever being thirsty. Who would have thought that? So you can't really trust your sense of thirst. Apparently, we have plenty of water. So anyway, he was 5 weeks in the hospital, and then he was let out, and they were saying, well, you should recover because it was acute kidney failure. You should recover in a month. And 6 months later, the doctor said, I'm sorry, Peter, you have now chronic kidney failure, because he should have recovered. The chance on survival on chronic kidney failure is 3% if you do nothing. And so they said the best thing to do now is put yourself on a waiting list for a kidney transplant and go on dialysis, otherwise you won't survive. Yeah, and that's when we ended up in, well, we thought, okay, we're going to enjoy his last months, really, you know, in a pleasant place with lots of comfort, and we got a house in Radha, close to here, and to enjoy the last weeks. And it's amazing how, again, time slowed down, and we enjoyed every day. And time seemed to stretch out. Yeah, it's amazing. It was a beautiful time. And then, lo and behold, he got better.
Yay for that. What I really loved, and you know a little bit about my story, was not everyone finds it easy to talk about death and the reality, the likelihood of it happening, and to be really honest about it. But I really admired your you know, as a couple, your ability to have those honest conversations, and that came from, I guess, you know, really accepting that death is inevitable, and it always hovered near him like a companion. Right?
Yeah, he didn't seem to be afraid of death. Because of experience in the past. And so when the diagnosis came with chronic kidney failure, he said, no, I'd rather die than go on dialysis. Yeah, this is how it happens.
Yeah.
So he was not afraid to die. And I think if you don't have that fear, you don't use up the energy. I think fear takes up a lot of energy. And if you don't use that, then that very energy can be used for recovery.
Yeah. I so agree. I believe that's true, yeah. That's where I had the other Paulo Coelho quote, because he says in The Alchemist, the fear of suffering is greater than suffering itself, which is kind of that idea, isn't it? Halfway through your book, you ask yourself, if I didn't have that fear of becoming an outcast, this is in the time with the crazy Simon in the ashram, what would life look like, and how much of my life is influenced by fear? So that was the question you were asking at that point in the story. Yeah. So I got the sense, though, a little bit, that you were finding it a little harder to accept that Peter, you know, that there might have been some fear of losing him when he looked like his health was not going to go the right way.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah. And so how did you deal with that fear when he was?
Yeah. So Peter was really sick in Marahau, and we believed that he would die because he did not want to go on transplant or dialysis. And I thought the chance would be really high that I have to live alone. But keep in mind that I knew this, right, from the beginning. So, and I also feel, we're very aware of the age difference, that Peter is also always preparing me, like, one day you will be on your own. You've got to be independent, and I think this is quite good, actually.
Yeah.
So, if I didn't think of Peter dying and all the terrible things that would happen, and just focus on the present, I was doing all right. But sometimes, of course, fear overcomes me, and I'm, you know, distraught. I'm, you know, like a claw taking out my throat. It's just horrible. Sometimes I cried, you know, terribly. But then I always remember, just focus on the present, because that's all we have. Yeah.
So, and I love it when Peter says, death is only bad if you're healthy.
Yeah, so he felt so bad and so terrible with this. What he says is chicken shit in his mouth, and his energy was so low, and itchy eyes, and you know, a lot of side effects. And he said, death is only bad if you're healthy. If you feel this terrible, you may as well go. Yeah. I don't know about this, I believe him.
Now, you made quite I'm going to call it a big decision when Peter was unwell, to go off into the wilderness again with Tamar.
Yeah, so this is a bit of a story. So we walked 2,000 kilometers in Europe and Bulgaria and Turkey. And then one day, we were eating something in the middle of the day, and I shouldered my pack again, and sort of, come on, Peter, we go. And he just looked at the pack, and I knew he had enough. He did not want to lift that pack again. And I said to Peter, you had enough, don't you? He said, yeah. He didn't need to explain very much, because I could see what had happened. He had just enough of long walking with a pack over many mountains. And then I was sad, because I really like being nomadic, walking through countries. I could have gone on, for many years. And Peter said, no, I have enough. We have to think of something else to do. Okay. But I don't have enough. And I thought, maybe I should join an expedition. And I talked about it with Peter, and Peter said, why don't you organize your own expedition in New Zealand that you know so well? And I thought, that's a good idea. I'm going to organize something never been done before, I hope, an epic female expedition. And it was great to just thought this up myself, so I can be the expedition leader. And I can put up a little video and ask for the wildest, strongest, and bravest women on this planet. I thought I aimed very high, and it worked. I got 200 applications. And it was great fun, but it's really difficult who to pick. Like all these women, they sound very good, they got a lot of experience with walking, but none of them had much experience with hunting. And so I thought, what shall I do? In the end, I thought I'll just go with one other person so that I can hunt for her. And it's a lot actually easier with 2 people rather than 5. And in the end, I went with another Dutch woman called Tamar. So with an expedition, you plan in the future, and this is the real downfall. So she had bought a ticket to New Zealand, we were preparing, we were all hyped up. And then Peter got sick. And then I thought, well, do I, cancel it all, or what shall I do? I don't want to leave him. And then Peter said, you should go into the wilderness. Luckily, we had found a friend who would look after Peter when he was so sick. So this is just after he came out of the hospital. And at that time, he seemed to improve a little bit. So, but it was really difficult, and I felt really guilty for walking off. But Peter kept encouraging me to go. And Tamar and I survived for 2.5 months just with rods and rifles. And we walked from Artis Pass towards Wanaka, but no route, nothing. We just saw the mountain and we climbed it the other side. The downfall is that if there's no route or a certain pass, you don't know if you can actually go there. For example, the waterfalls that are not more than 20 meters are not on the map. So sometimes we go on the other side and then we see a waterfall 15 meters, but we can't go past that, right? So we're all the way back up and all around. So it was an amazing challenge, and we felt so proud that we were doing this and could survive. We got very hungry, and we filled our stomach with snowberries and totaberries a lot. Overall, we got lots of animals, but sometimes it was a little bit tricky. But yeah, amazing adventure. I'm very grateful that I've done it. And Peter said, this might be your last time in the wilderness, so you may as well enjoy it. Because when I came back, he had deteriorated so much, and we thought, well, this is it. Now we have to live in town. Yeah. Yeah, so it was a very emotional period.
Yeah. Great. I'm going to ask one more question, but I just want to open up for other if anyone else has a question, just pop. The wonderful Hella is going to grab the radio mic here. And pulls it. Yeah. Does anyone have a question? Yeah, right here in the front. Yeah.
Oh, can I speak without the mic? Can you hear me?
If you could use the microphone, please, because we're recording.
Sorry, I don't. I'm not cute. If that's okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, fine. Thank you. How much time have you spent totally alone in the wilderness, alone with your heart, 1 day, 1 week? Tell us about being totally alone, not a hermit, but just alone.
Alone without Peter, you mean?
Without anybody, just alone.
Yeah, last summer I went into the Dragon's Teeth, just underneath in Kaihurangi National Park, and I spent there 10 days on my own, and it was indeed very different. And again, the sense of time, so 1 day felt like a month, and it is very, very interesting to do this on your own, and because the mind becomes more calm, because you don't have to communicate with anyone. And then I felt I was just like one of the animals. The goats were walking around, and the deer were walking around, and I was walking around. And I was just sitting there. I wasn't going from A to B. I was just being in the valley and hunt, and just sit and wait, and look at where the goats might go. Yeah, so that is, again, very, very different. But I would not want to live really in the wilderness on my own. I think it's much more interesting long-term to be with a partner. So yes, I'm very glad I'm with Peter.
Any other questions? Up there? No? Okay. I have a question. Would you like to sing?
Sing! I've got one song indeed. Some of you might have heard it last year. This song is called Wild at Heart. And I've written this song
8 years ago.
probably 8 years ago. Yeah. It's about our life and about Peter. Peter is a great person to talk about and to write about. He is, as you have noticed, he is such a character. And I found him very courageous because, as shows in this story, he is not afraid of death, and therefore I think he can live more fully. And this is such a great inspiration for me, and hopefully for the reader as well. Yeah, I'll stand up for the song. Sorry. I met a wild man, he lives with me. He dares to live a life without security. He teaches me to stand alone. No status in the world, no place to call my home. Ya-da-da-da, ya-da-da, ya-da-da-da, 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 ya-da-da-da-da-da. We walk in the mountains, I hunt in the valleys. We sleep on the ground in a place that we have found. The call of the geese echoes in the trees. I receive the energy straight from the earth. Yeah, straight from the earth. Thank you.
And yes, of course, we have a couple of very special guests in the audience today, don't we?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. So for those of you who haven't seen him, Peter is here today. Welcome, Peter.
So I've been to 12 writers' festivals, and this was the first time Peter heard me speak. So it's quite different.
And also in the audience is Mouse, who you may remember from Women in the Wilderness.
Anyone read the first book? Here. Our good friend Mouse has come all the way to Nelson to see us. Thank you so much for being here.
So Miriam will be available outside in the foyer to, obviously you can buy the book from our lovely Page and Blackmore bookstore and come and meet Miriam and get her to sign the book and have a chat, and maybe Peter will be happy to have a chat to people too, we'll see. Yeah? He's nodding. That's wonderful. So I want to say a huge thank you to the multi-talented Miriam Lancewood.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for the song as well as for being so generous with your storytelling. And a big thank you to JR for sound, for Hella helping out, for the wonderful ushers who got you into the theatre, for all the Nelson Arts Festival team. So it's been my pleasure to be here today to talk to Miriam. So please join me in a final round of applause for Miriam Lancewood.